There was a time when I thought family meant everything, when I believed that no matter what happened, my son would always have my back. But then, everything changed in an instant. My own flesh and blood, the one I'd sacrificed so much for, turned on me in the most painful way imaginable. It wasn't just a simple argument. It was a betrayal, a public humiliation that shook me to my core. My son, Leo, told his friends that I was an old fool, someone who couldn't keep up with the world around him. And when I overheard those words, my heart sank. For a moment, I felt like I had failed as a father. But instead of reacting with anger, something inside me snapped. I realized that I didn't need his approval to feel worthy. In fact, I wasn't going to let this define me. I decided that if Leo couldn't see my worth, I would show him in the most powerful way possible. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply got to work. I built something for myself, something that would prove just how wrong he was. While Leo laughed at my age and my experience, I quietly started a project, a tech startup, using everything I'd learned over the years. I wasn't just going to prove him wrong, I was going to flip the entire situation on its head, and in the end, I would have the last laugh. I knew this wasn't just about success. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my respect, and showing Leo that no matter what he thought of me, I would always stand tall. What happened next would change everything. Gary had spent his life working tirelessly, never asking for much in return. He wasn't a man of wealth or extravagance, but he had always been rich in the things that mattered most: love for his family, loyalty to his principles, and a fierce work ethic that defined every aspect of his life. Raised in a modest town, Gary had learned early on that life didn't hand out favors. It took hard work, sacrifice, and an unbreakable will to succeed. He had started from nothing, his early years spent toiling away at odd jobs, climbing the ladder from one small achievement to the next. Every step, every struggle had been with the goal of providing for his family, especially his son, Leo. Gary wasn't the type to boast about his sacrifices. To him, family came first, always. He took pride in being a provider, a protector, and a guide. He was the kind of father who showed up no matter what. He stayed late at the office, worked weekends, and never once complained. His house, though small, was always filled with warmth, his love evident in every corner. Leo, his only son, was the apple of his eye, the reason Gary worked so hard. He dreamed of giving Leo a life better than the one he had known, a life filled with opportunities he had only hoped for as a young man. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Gary hadn't noticed it at first. It was subtle, small shifts in Leo's behavior that he brushed off as growing pains. The way Leo became increasingly distant, the way his admiration for his father seemed to fade with age. Gary never imagined that his son, the one he poured so much into, would one day turn his back on him in such a cruel and humiliating way. The shift was so gradual, he didn't even see it coming. They had always shared an unspoken bond, a bond of mutual respect, even if they didn't always agree. Leo had grown up watching his father juggle work, family, and everything in between. Gary's world was simple. He didn't need much. But as Leo grew older, he became increasingly influenced by the world around him, by people who didn't understand the sacrifices his father had made. There was a new sense of entitlement in Leo's eyes, a belief that he deserved more, that he should be living a life beyond what Gary could provide. And that's when the cracks started to show. Gary knew Leo's friends didn't quite understand him. They were younger, more carefree, and they lived in a world that had no place for hard work and sacrifice. They admired the fast pace of life, the thrill of instant gratification, and they often mocked anything that seemed out of touch with their reality. And yet, Gary didn't mind that Leo had these friends. He understood that his son needed to find his own path. What hurt him was how Leo began to internalize their criticism. Over time, Gary noticed a shift in his son's attitude, how Leo began to make subtle jokes at his expense, mocking his old-fashioned ways, his quiet strength, and his refusal to keep up with modern trends. Gary always took it in stride, never responding with anger, never challenging Leo's newfound beliefs. He didn't want to push his son away. He believed that eventually Leo would come to appreciate the value of hard work, respect, and the life that Gary had built for him. But that day, when Leo mocked him in front of his friends, everything changed. It wasn't just the words. It was the look in Leo's eyes, the casual dismissal of everything Gary had done for him. It stung in a way that Gary had never felt before. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that Leo didn't understand the sacrifices he had made. More importantly, Leo didn't seem to care. That night, after hearing Leo's mocking laughter echo through the house, Gary sat alone in his small office, his thoughts spinning. He could have yelled, could have confronted Leo right there. But something inside him told him that wasn't the way. His life had never been about shouting the loudest. It had been about showing up and doing the work, no matter how hard it got. And so, instead of responding with anger, Gary made a quiet decision. He wasn't going to fight Leo with words. He was going to fight with action. Gary decided that the best way to show his son the error of his ways wasn't through confrontation. It was through transformation. He wasn't going to prove his worth by getting angry or demanding respect. Instead, he would show Leo and everyone else that he was more than capable of achieving greatness on his own. Gary's decision to build a tech company, something he'd always dreamed of but never had the time or resources to pursue, was born out of this moment of clarity. He would take all the years of experience, all the skills he'd accumulated, and channel them into something new, something big. Gary's world had always been simple. Work hard, provide for your family, and keep your head down. But now, his world was about to change in a way he never imagined. He would build something from nothing, something that would force Leo and the world to take notice. This wasn't just about proving his son wrong. It was about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth and showing that no matter how old you were, you could still build something meaningful. Something that would make Leo and everyone else realize that Gary was far more than just an old fool. As Gary began to pour his heart and soul into building his new venture, the emotional weight of what had transpired between him and Leo became increasingly difficult to ignore. Every day, Gary would rise early, often before the sun, and dive into the technicalities of his business. He had spent decades honing his skills, working on projects for other companies, but this was different. This wasn't just about putting in the hours for a paycheck. It was about proving to himself and the world that he still had what it took. Gary wasn't trying to get back at Leo. He wasn't trying to show him that he was right and Leo was wrong. No, this was about reclaiming his own sense of purpose, something he had lost when his son, the one person he thought he could trust the most, dismissed him in front of his friends. But as Gary immersed himself in this new challenge, the conflict within him only grew. He had spent his entire life supporting Leo, making sure that he had everything he needed. But now, it seemed that his son's resentment had created an emotional rift that couldn't be easily repaired. Gary's mind often wandered back to that painful moment, the day Leo mocked him in front of his friends. He remembered the sting in his chest as he overheard Leo's words. He had worked so hard to give his son a better life, to provide him with opportunities, and yet Leo seemed to take it all for granted. The more Gary worked, the more he realized that something deeper had been broken between him and Leo. It wasn't just about the tech company or proving his worth. It was about trust, respect, and love. Gary wasn't sure if he could ever rebuild what had been lost. The emotional distance between him and his son felt like an insurmountable barrier. No matter how successful he became, no matter how much money the business brought in, he couldn't shake the feeling that something irreparable had happened. And Leo? He wasn't exactly making things easier. For weeks, Gary had been focused solely on his business, putting all his energy into its success. But every now and then, he'd see a message from Leo or hear about something his son had done or said through mutual acquaintances. Leo had never once apologized, not for mocking him, not for humiliating him, and certainly not for dismissing everything Gary had worked so hard for. In fact, it was as if Leo was completely oblivious to the damage he had caused. Gary's frustration grew with every passing day. The more Leo distanced himself, the more Gary realized that his son had changed in ways he couldn't quite understand. He used to be so full of potential, so willing to listen and learn from the example Gary had set. But now, Leo had turned into someone else, a young man more focused on appearances, on living a life of instant gratification, than on building something with lasting value. It wasn't just about the hurtful words anymore. It was about the realization that Leo no longer shared the same values that Gary had worked so hard to instill. It was in these moments of reflection that Gary began to question himself. Was it his fault that Leo had become so disconnected? Had he failed as a father? Gary had always believed in leading by example, but had he missed something? Had he overlooked the signs that his son was slipping away from him, caught up in a world that didn't value the same things he did? But no matter how much Gary questioned his own actions, there was one truth that kept him moving forward. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't change the fact that Leo had treated him with such disdain. What he could change, however, was the future. The more he worked on his business, the more he realized that his success wouldn't be defined by Leo's opinion of him. This wasn't about his son. This was about proving to himself that he was still capable, still worthy, and still able to make something of himself, even if his own flesh and blood didn't see it. Yet, the conflict between father and son remained unresolved. Gary's heart ached as he watched his son move further away from him, as if a great chasm had opened between them, one that seemed impossible to cross. No matter how successful Gary became, no matter how much he achieved, he couldn't fill the void that Leo's rejection had created. The pain of that emotional distance lingered, clouding every victory, every milestone in Gary's business journey. And so, the real question remained. Could Gary ever rebuild the relationship with his son? Could he find a way to reach Leo, to make him see that the man he had mocked was still a man worth respecting? Or would the gulf between them grow even wider as Gary continued to forge ahead, creating a life that, in some ways, seemed to be leaving Leo further behind? The tension between the father who had always given everything and the son who now seemed determined to reject him was about to reach a boiling point. Both men were on a path that would force them to confront their own beliefs, their own values, and perhaps, in the end, each other. The days passed in a blur for Gary. His tech company began to show signs of success, but the feeling of accomplishment felt hollow without the one person he thought would understand it most. Every time his business reached a new milestone, a new level of recognition, Gary's mind would drift back to Leo. He found it hard to truly celebrate without sharing these victories with his son. He had worked so hard for this, had invested years of his life to give Leo the life he never had. And now, it felt like all of that sacrifice had been thrown back in his face. And Leo? He wasn't exactly making things easier. For weeks, Gary had been focused solely on his business, putting all his energy into its success. But every now and then, he'd see a message from Leo or hear about something his son had done or said through mutual acquaintances. Leo had never once apologized, not for mocking him, not for humiliating him, and certainly not for dismissing everything Gary had worked so hard for. In fact, it was as if Leo was completely oblivious to the damage he had caused. Gary's frustration grew with every passing day. The more Leo distanced himself, the more Gary realized that his son had changed in ways he couldn't quite understand. He used to be so full of potential, so willing to listen and learn from the example Gary had set. But now, Leo had turned into someone else, a young man more focused on appearances, on living a life of instant gratification, than on building something with lasting value. It wasn't just about the hurtful words anymore. It was about the realization that Leo no longer shared the same values that Gary had worked so hard to instill. It was in these moments of reflection that Gary began to question himself. Was it his fault that Leo had become so disconnected? Had he failed as a father? Gary had always believed in leading by example, but had he missed something? Had he overlooked the signs that his son was slipping away from him, caught up in a world that didn't value the same things he did? But no matter how much Gary questioned his own actions, there was one truth that kept him moving forward. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't change the fact that Leo had treated him with such disdain. What he could change, however, was the future. The more he worked on his business, the more he realized that his success wouldn't be defined by Leo's opinion of him. This wasn't about his son. This was about proving to himself that he was still capable, still worthy, and still able to make something of himself, even if his own flesh and blood didn't see it. Yet, the conflict between father and son remained unresolved. Gary's heart ached as he watched his son move further away from him, as if a great chasm had opened between them, one that seemed impossible to cross. No matter how successful Gary became, no matter how much he achieved, he couldn't fill the void that Leo's rejection had created. The pain of that emotional distance lingered, clouding every victory, every milestone in Gary's business journey. And so, the real question remained: could Gary ever rebuild the relationship with his son? Could he find a way to reach Leo, to make him see that the man he had mocked was still a man worth respecting? Or would the gulf between them grow even wider as Gary continued to forge ahead, creating a life that, in some ways, seemed to be leaving Leo further behind? The tension between the father who had always given everything and the son who now seemed determined to reject him was about to reach a boiling point. Both men were on a path that would force them to confront their own beliefs, their own values, and perhaps, in the end, each other. The days passed in a blur for Gary. His tech company began to show signs of success, but the feeling of accomplishment felt hollow without the one person he thought would understand it most. Every time his business reached a new milestone, a new level of recognition, Gary's mind would drift back to Leo. He found it hard to truly celebrate without sharing these victories with his son. He had worked so hard for this, had invested years of his life to give Leo the life he never had. And now, it felt like all of that sacrifice had been thrown back in his face. But that day, something shifted. It wasn't an external event or a conversation with anyone. It was an internal realization, a moment of clarity that seemed to pierce through the fog of his own emotions. Gary sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, allowed himself to reflect. Not on the business, not on the failures or successes, but on himself. It was as if a light had been switched on, illuminating something he had been blind to. He realized that the pain of Leo's rejection wasn't about the things Leo had said or done. It wasn't about the public humiliation or the mockery. The pain was deeper than that. It was about the fact that he had been tying his sense of worth to his son's approval. Gary had spent his entire life measuring his success by what others thought of him. First his peers, then his friends, and now his own son. But in doing so, he had lost sight of something essential. He had spent so many years trying to prove his value to the people he loved that he had forgotten to prove it to himself. It was a harsh realization, one that stung as much as it freed him. In that moment, Gary understood that he had been chasing validation from external sources his entire life. He had built a business to prove to Leo that he was capable, that he was worth respecting. He had worked tirelessly to build something grand, something that would make Leo proud. But the truth was, Gary had never needed Leo's approval to be worthy. He had always been worthy of respect, love, and success, not because of what he achieved, but because of who he was. This epiphany hit Gary like a wave. For the first time, he saw that his life, his identity, couldn't be defined by his son's perception of him. Leo's rejection, painful as it was, didn't diminish Gary's value. It didn't change the sacrifices he had made, the work he had done, or the love he had given. Gary had spent so much time trying to fix something outside of himself that he had neglected the most important relationship, the one he had with himself. The realization wasn't easy to accept, but it was liberating. It was as though a weight had been lifted off his chest. The truth was, Gary didn't need Leo to validate his worth. He had spent decades building a life, a business, and a reputation that spoke for itself. It wasn't about Leo seeing it. It was about Gary understanding it. He was a man who had worked hard, sacrificed much, and succeeded in his own right. His value didn't hinge on anyone else's approval. Gary sat in silence for a long time, reflecting on everything that had brought him to this point. The pain, the rejection, the loneliness, all of it had led to this moment of self-realization. He could no longer tie his worth to his son's approval, and that realization shifted everything. Gary knew that the next steps weren't going to be easy. Rebuilding a relationship with Leo would take time, and it was no longer about proving anything to him. If Leo was ever going to come around, it would have to be on his own terms. Gary couldn't force his son to see him differently, but he could choose to see himself differently. The success of his business, the respect he had earned, and the love he had given, these were the things that defined him now. It was time to let go of the past and move forward with the truth that he had always been enough, regardless of Leo's view. And so, with this revelation came a newfound clarity. Gary's path forward wasn't about seeking redemption through others. It was about reclaiming his own sense of self-worth and, in the process, finding peace. He had always been a man of action, a man who worked tirelessly to achieve his goals. But now, for the first time, Gary understood that the most important work of all was the work he needed to do on himself. The next few weeks were an emotional roller coaster for Gary. With a newfound clarity of his own worth, he decided to focus on his journey ahead, not as a father seeking validation from his son, but as a man who had something to prove to himself. He continued to build his business, pushing it to even greater heights. The success was no longer about proving anything to Leo. It was about proving to himself that he could stand tall, regardless of who was by his side or who believed in him. Yet, despite the peace he had found within himself, the pain of his fractured relationship with Leo never truly disappeared. Gary's mind would often wander back to his son, the boy he had raised with so much love and care. The sting of Leo's rejection would creep up at the most unexpected moments, especially as Gary's achievements continued to pile up. There was no joy in the victories that felt so hollow without Leo to share them with. The emptiness was palpable, but Gary wasn't the same man anymore. The anger and frustration that had consumed him for so long slowly gave way to an understanding, one that was less about seeking approval and more about accepting the reality of his situation. He couldn't control how Leo saw him, but he could control how he saw himself. He could choose to move forward, even if Leo wasn't ready to be a part of that journey. It wasn't until one evening, several months after his self-realization, that everything came to a head. Gary had just wrapped up a major meeting with a potential investor when his phone buzzed. It was a text message from Leo, an unexpected message that sent a jolt through Gary's chest. "Dad, can we talk? I've been thinking a lot about everything lately." Gary stared at the message for a long time, unsure of what to make of it. His heart raced as a flood of emotions hit him. Part of him wanted to respond immediately, to reconnect, to try and heal the wounds that had been inflicted. But another part of him, the part that had spent so long trying to find his own voice, hesitated. He had been through so much to get to this point. The emotional upheaval, the heartache, the realization that he didn't need anyone's approval to be whole. Could this be the moment he had been waiting for? Or was it just another false hope? Gary took a deep breath and set the phone down, trying to calm the storm inside him. The message was a sign of something, maybe the start of a new chapter. But Gary knew that this wasn't about rushing into anything. This was a moment to reflect, to consider the long road ahead. For so long, he had wanted Leo to come back into his life, to acknowledge him, to apologize. But now, he realized that if Leo was going to be a part of his life again, it had to be on equal footing. Gary had to make sure that this time, he wasn't giving up his sense of self in the process. After a few moments of stillness, Gary responded, "We can talk. I'm ready whenever you are." As the message was sent, Gary couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief. It wasn't about getting everything back to the way it was. It was about moving forward, about showing Leo that he was still the man he had always been. Only now, he had a deeper understanding of his own value. Whether or not Leo was ready to accept, that was another question entirely. The following day, Gary and Leo arranged to meet at a cafe near Gary's office. When Leo arrived, he looked different, more subdued, more thoughtful. He didn't wear the cocky arrogance that Gary had seen in him before. Instead, there was an air of vulnerability that Gary hadn't expected. It was a side of his son that Gary hadn't seen in years, and it hit him harder than he imagined. As they sat down, the silence between them was heavy. Gary could feel the weight of everything unspoken between them. The hurt, the disappointment, the distance. But for the first time, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words of defense or justification. This was a new moment, a moment where neither of them had to prove anything. Gary had already done the work on himself. Now it was Leo's turn. Leo broke the silence first. "Dad, I've been an idiot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know why I did it. The way I treated you, it was wrong." Gary looked at him for a long moment, his eyes softening. The words Leo spoke weren't enough to erase the past, but they were a start. Gary had spent so much time waiting for an apology for a moment like this, but now he realized it wasn't about waiting for Leo to fix things. It was about both of them growing, both of them finding a new way forward. "I'm glad you're here, Leo," Gary said quietly. "But we're not going to fix everything in one conversation. We got a lot to work through, and I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't hurt, because it does. But I'm willing to try if you are." Leo nodded, his eyes welling with tears. "I want to try, Dad. I'm so sorry." Gary felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't a magical moment of instant forgiveness, but it was real, and it was enough. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something new, a new kind of relationship that would take time to heal, to rebuild. But for the first time in months, Gary felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but they had both taken the first step. And for Gary, that was enough. The following weeks after their conversation were filled with a mixture of anticipation and unease. Gary and Leo didn't immediately fall back into the easy rhythm they once shared. In fact, the road ahead was filled with moments of awkward silence and tentative steps, as both father and son navigated the uncharted territory of rebuilding trust. But there was something different now, something Gary hadn't expected. Despite the heavy weight of their past, there was a sense of mutual respect slowly beginning to grow between them. Gary could see it in Leo's eyes, the regret, the desire to make things right, and the willingness to put in the work. Leo had never been the type to express his feelings easily, but now he was trying, in his own way, to show his father that he was ready to make amends. And Gary, for his part, found himself willing to be patient, to let Leo grow at his own pace, without forcing a reconciliation before it was truly ready. One evening, Gary invited Leo to the office. The company had just secured a new deal with a major investor, and it was a milestone that would further cement the business as a true industry contender. Gary knew this would be a good opportunity to share something with Leo, not just about business, but about life. As they sat in Gary's office, looking out at the city skyline, Gary felt a sense of quiet pride. "I've come a long way, Leo," Gary said, breaking the silence. "This company, it's more than just a business to me. It's about proving something to myself. It's about showing that no matter how old you are, no matter how much life tries to knock you down, you can still rebuild, still grow." Leo looked at his father, a mixture of awe and understanding in his gaze. "I've been thinking about that, Dad," he admitted, "about how much you've sacrificed. And I get it now. I was wrong to judge you, wrong to think that everything you did was out of touch. I see how hard you've worked, how much you've given, and I'm sorry I didn't appreciate that." Gary nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. The apology wasn't what he had expected, but it was what he needed. And yet, as much as he appreciated Leo's words, Gary understood that actions spoke louder than words. This wasn't just about Leo saying sorry. It was about Leo showing that he was ready to put in the effort, that he was willing to do the work to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. "Thank you, Leo," Gary said quietly. "But words alone aren't going to fix this. We've both got a lot of growing to do. And I'm not expecting everything to be perfect, but I'm willing to try. Are you?" Leo's face softened, and for the first time in a long while, Gary saw the son he had once known, the eager young man, ready to take on the world, yet still needing guidance and love. It was a moment of clarity for Gary, a realization that his son wasn't perfect, but he was trying. That was all he could ask for. "I'm in, Dad," Leo replied, his voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Gary felt a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't an instant resolution, and it wasn't a magical fix to all the pain they had gone through. But it was a start. And for the first time in months, Gary could see a glimmer of the future he had hoped for. A future where he and Leo could rebuild their relationship, step by step, no longer bound by the weight of past mistakes, but rather united by the understanding that both of them had room to grow. As they talked that evening, Gary realized that the business wasn't the only thing he had been building. It was his life, his relationship with his son, and his own sense of self-worth. The success of the company had been important, but it was the healing of the rift between him and Leo that had always mattered most. And in that moment, as he looked at his son, Gary understood that this was the true victory. It wasn't about proving Leo wrong. It was about both of them realizing that no matter how much they had been hurt, they were still capable of finding their way back to each other. As the evening drew to a close, Gary and Leo stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. There was still much to be done, much to work through, but for the first time in a long while, Gary felt hope. The kind of hope that comes from knowing that no matter how difficult the road had been, both of them were finally on the same path, walking forward together. Gary knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that with time, patience, and mutual respect, they could rebuild the relationship that had once seemed lost. And that in itself was enough. The weeks that followed were a turning point for both Gary and Leo. Though the road to healing wasn't without its bumps, there was a tangible shift in their relationship. They started spending more time together, not just for business or obligatory family gatherings, but because they genuinely wanted to reconnect. It was as if a new understanding had emerged, one where both father and son were willing to meet each other halfway. For Gary, it was a profound realization. His journey towards self-worth, which had once been defined by the opinions and validation of others, had shifted. It was no longer about seeking approval from Leo or anyone else. It was about finding peace within himself. He had rebuilt his life, not just through business success, but through learning how to value himself without relying on external recognition. Gary was proud of the man he had become. His success wasn't just measured in the growth of his company. It was reflected in the strength of his character and the resilience he had found after everything he had gone through. Leo, too, underwent a transformation. As he spent more time with his father, he began to understand the depth of Gary's sacrifices, the weight of his silent strength. He began to see beyond the surface. The man who had worked tirelessly to build a life for him, who had always been there, even when Leo didn't see it. Leo wasn't the same person he had been when he'd mocked his father. He was learning that success wasn't just about fast-paced wins or instant gratification. It was about long-term growth, perseverance, and the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. Leo had learned that from Gary, even if it hadn't been an easy lesson. The business continued to thrive, and as it did, Gary and Leo found themselves collaborating more. It wasn't just a father-son dynamic anymore. It was a partnership. They each brought something to the table: Gary's wisdom and experience, Leo's fresh ideas and energy. And together, they created something stronger than they could have on their own. The work they did together wasn't just about success. It was about mending the bond that had once seemed broken beyond repair. One afternoon, as they sat together in the office, looking at plans for the future, Gary paused and looked at Leo. "I'm proud of you, Leo," Gary said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for the man you're becoming. I can't tell you how much that means to me." Leo met his father's gaze, a faint smile on his lips. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," he replied. "You've shown me what really matters. It's not about being the loudest or the quickest. It's about sticking to what's right, even when no one's watching. You've taught me that." The simplicity of their exchange spoke volumes. In that moment, Gary realized that this was the true reward. It wasn't the accolades, the business deals, or the recognition. It was the quiet understanding between them, the recognition of each other's growth, and the love that had endured through everything. Their relationship, though scarred, had been rebuilt, piece by piece, until it had become something even stronger than it had been before. As Gary reflected on everything they had been through, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Life had tested him, had pushed him to his limits, but it had also given him something invaluable, the chance to rebuild not just his business, but his relationship with his son. He had learned that the most important thing in life wasn't success in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of the people you loved. In the end, Gary's journey wasn't just about proving himself. It was about discovering that the most important validation came from within, and that the love of family, though sometimes complicated, was worth more than any accolade or accomplishment. He had come full circle, and the peace he felt now was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As Gary and Leo continued to grow together, they both understood that life wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. They would face challenges in the future, but they would face them together, with the understanding that no matter how difficult the road, they had each other. And that, Gary realized, was enough. The story was far from over, but this chapter had come to a close with a quiet victory. The rebuilding of a father-son relationship that had once seemed lost, and the understanding that, in the end, it was the people we love and who love us in return that make everything truly worthwhile. Have you ever experienced a moment in life where you felt disconnected from someone you love? A relationship that seemed broken beyond repair? We all face moments of conflict, but what truly matters is how we choose to move forward. Gary's journey reminds us that healing, growth, and reconciliation take time, patience, and a willingness to see each other with new eyes. If you've ever been in a similar situation, or if you're currently navigating the complexities of rebuilding a relationship, we want to hear your story. How have you overcome challenges in your relationships? What lessons have you learned along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the power of resilience, understanding, and forgiveness. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit that like button to show your support. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of human relationships, personal growth, and the power of second chances. We put a lot of effort into creating these videos, and your support means the world to us. Remember, it's never too late to start healing, to rebuild, or to transform your relationships. Stay with us for more content that dives into real-life stories, lessons learned, and the courage it takes to move forward, no matter what. We appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to watch, comment, and share. So, go ahead, subscribe.